The Wilsons had always dreamed of a house in the country. When they stumbled upon the old Victorian home on the edge of town, they felt like they'd found a hidden gem. It was rustic, with creaking floors and an eerie charm, but for Tommy, their 6-year-old, the house felt anything but charming. On the first night, as the family settled in, Tommy lay awake in his new room, his eyes darting around the dark corners, his small hands clutching the covers. That night, the whispers began. Faint at first, like a breeze rustling through leaves, but then they grew clearer, more distinct. Tommy squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the sound. He told himself it was just the house settling, like his parents said, or maybe a stray cat outside. But the whispers were coming from inside the room, from beneath his bed. "Mom. Dad." Tommy's voice was barely a whisper itself as he called out. His parents, exhausted from the move, dismissed his fears with gentle reassurances. "It's just your imagination, Tommy," his mom said, tucking him back in. His dad chuckled, "You're just not used to the new house yet, buddy." But Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As he lay in the darkness, he could hear it again, a soft, rhythmic breathing, just beneath his mattress. The hairs on his arms stood up as he turned his head slowly, daring to peek over the edge of the bed. He didn't see anything, but the breathing continued, growing louder, more deliberate. The next morning, Tommy told his parents about the breathing. His mother, busy with unpacking, just nodded absent-mindedly. His father suggested it was probably a raccoon or some other animal that had gotten into the house. "We'll check it out later," he promised. But later never came, and nightfall brought with it the same terror. Tommy's fears only grew. Every night, the sounds became more insistent, a scraping, like nails against wood, and the whispering, now accompanied by a low growl. It was as if the thing under the bed knew Tommy was afraid and fed off his fear. Sleep became a distant memory, and dark circles formed under his young eyes. Tommy began dreading the night, knowing that as soon as the lights went out, the torment would begin again. Tommy's parents started to notice the changes in their son. He was no longer the bright, cheerful boy they knew. Instead, he was quiet and withdrawn, flinching at every creak of the floorboards. At night, his screams became more frequent, more desperate. The shadows in his room seemed darker, more oppressive, as if they had a life of their own. Despite their growing concern, his parents chalked it up to the stress of moving into a new home. "He's just adjusting," his father would say, though the doubt was beginning to creep into his voice. One night, Tommy woke up to a feeling of pressure on his chest, like something heavy was sitting on him. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. His eyes darted around the room in terror, searching for his parents, but they were nowhere to be found. The only thing he could see was the faint outline of a figure standing at the foot of his bed, shrouded in darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its eyes were glowing a sickly yellow. Tommy's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to call out, but his voice was trapped in his throat. Suddenly, the figure bent down, its long, bony fingers reaching out towards him. The nails scraped against the wooden floor, making a sound that sent chills down Tommy's spine. He squeezed his eyes shut, hoping that when he opened them, it would all be a bad dream. But when he dared to peek again, the figure was closer, its face inches from his. It whispered his name, Tommy, in a voice that was both a hiss and a growl. He could feel its cold breath on his face, could see its twisted grin. When he finally managed to scream, his parents rushed into the room, flicking on the lights. But there was nothing there. "It was just a nightmare," his mother soothed, holding him tight, though her eyes flickered with unease. Just a bad dream. Tommy knew better. He could still feel the coldness in the room, the lingering sense of something malevolent. He tried to explain what he saw, but his father just shook his head. "It's all in your head, son," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Things escalated from there. During the day, Tommy began noticing his toys were not where he left them. His favorite action figure, Captain Courage, was always under the bed, no matter how many times he moved it back to the shelf. His drawings started to change too. Where once there were pictures of his family and friends, now there were dark scribbles, monsters with yellow eyes hiding under beds, waiting. Tommy swore he didn't draw them, but no one believed him. His parents brought in a child psychologist, hoping to get to the bottom of what they assumed was a case of childhood anxiety. Dr. Benson was kind and patient, listening carefully to Tommy's fears. "Monsters aren't real, Tommy," she said softly during one of their sessions. "They're just stories we tell ourselves when we're scared." But as she spoke, Tommy could see a shadow move behind her chair. He pointed, trying to warn her, but she just smiled sympathetically, thinking he was reacting to her words. That evening, Tommy's babysitter, Sarah, came over to watch him while his parents went out for the night. She was in college, studying psychology, and thought nothing of Tommy's stories about monsters under the bed. "I used to be scared of the dark too, you know," she said, ruffling his hair. But as the night wore on and Tommy fell asleep on the couch, Sarah heard it too, the scratching, the low growl, the whisper of Tommy's name from his bedroom. Curious and a bit unsettled, Sarah decided to check it out. She crept upstairs, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet, and slowly pushed open the door to Tommy's room. At first, she saw nothing unusual. But then, she heard a soft, almost imperceptible breathing coming from under the bed. Her heart skipped a beat. "Tommy," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. There was no answer. With a mix of dread and skepticism, she crouched down, lifting the edge of the bedspread. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, deeper and blacker than it should have been. And then she saw them, two glowing yellow eyes staring back at her, filled with malice. Before she could scream, a cold, clammy hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with an unnatural strength and pulling her under. The room fell silent, save for the soft sound of the bed creaking as it settled back into place. When Tommy woke up later that night, he found himself alone. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. He called out for Sarah, but there was no reply. As he made his way to his bedroom, he noticed the door was ajar. Pushing it open, he saw her phone on the floor, screen cracked, and the faint outline of something large and dark moving under his bed. Inch of the house and surrounding property, but Sarah was nowhere to be found. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Tommy tried to tell them what had happened, about the monster under the bed and how it had taken Sarah. But no one believed him. They were convinced that she had simply left, or worse, that something had happened to her outside the home. His father, in a moment of frustration, snapped at him, "Enough with this monster nonsense, Tommy. You're scaring your mother." But his mother's face told a different story. There was fear there, a fear that perhaps, just maybe, Tommy was telling the truth. That evening, after the police had left and the house was quiet once again, Tommy's mother decided to look through the old boxes left behind by the previous owners. She had hoped to find something, anything, that might explain what was happening to her family. As she rummaged through the dusty cardboard, she found a small, leather-bound journal hidden beneath a pile of old clothes. Its pages were yellowed with age, the writing faded and hard to read. As she flipped through the journal, her eyes widened in horror. It was filled with stories, all written by different hands, about a creature that lived under the bed, tormenting the children who dared to sleep in that room. Each entry was more disturbing than the last, recounting tales of whispering voices, glowing eyes, and children who disappeared without a trace. The last entry was the most chilling of all. It was written by a child, barely legible, describing how the monster had taken his little brother. Desperate for answers, Tommy's parents decided to contact the local historical society. They hoped to learn more about the house's past, and if there was any truth to the stories in the journal. An elderly woman named Mrs. Harding met them at the old library. She had lived in the town her whole life and knew all its secrets. When they mentioned the address of their home, her face grew pale. "That house," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That house has a dark history." Mrs. Harding went on to explain that many years ago, a boy named Edward had disappeared from that very house. His parents claimed he was taken by a monster under the bed, but no one believed them. They were shunned by the town, considered mad with grief. But the disappearances didn't stop. Over the decades, children who stayed in that room would complain of strange noises and shadows before vanishing without a trace. "The town tried to forget," she said, "but some things don't let go so easily." Armed with this new information, Tommy's parents realized they could no longer ignore their son's fears. They had to take action, and fast. That night, they sat Tommy down and asked him to describe everything he had experienced, in detail. Tommy hesitated, unsure if they would believe him this time, but the sincerity in their eyes convinced him. He told them about the whispers, the growling, and the yellow eyes under the bed. Deciding that it was time to confront whatever was haunting their son, Tommy's father borrowed a flashlight from the garage and carefully approached his son's room. His heart pounded in his chest as he knelt beside the bed, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. He slowly lifted the bedspread, his breath catching in his throat as the flashlight flickered ominously. At first, there was nothing, just an empty void under the bed, dark and cold. He let out a sigh of relief, starting to believe they might have been imagining things after all. But then, something moved. A small, barely perceptible shift in the shadows. He leaned in closer, squinting to see what it was, when suddenly, the flashlight flickered again and went out. His heart leapt into his throat, and for a moment, he thought he heard a soft chuckle. Frantically, he banged the flashlight against his palm, trying to get it to turn back on. When it did, the light revealed a pair of glowing yellow eyes staring back at him from the darkness. He gasped, stumbling back in shock, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting wild shadows on the walls. His wife screamed from the doorway, "What is it? What did you see?" But he couldn't answer. All he could do was stare at the darkness under the bed, knowing now that Tommy had been right all along. They decided to reach out to a paranormal investigator, a man known for dealing with hauntings and malevolent spirits. His name was Father Donovan, a priest who had dedicated his life to confronting the supernatural. He arrived the next day, his face grim and serious as he listened to their story. "These entities," he explained, "they feed on fear. The more afraid you are, the stronger they become." Father Donovan set up a series of rituals and protections around the house, drawing symbols and chanting prayers to ward off the entity. He instructed Tommy to sleep in the living room, away from his bedroom. "We have to weaken it," he said, "to take away its power." But even as he spoke, Tommy could hear the faint whispers starting again, coming from the shadows. It was as if the monster knew they were trying to fight back and was growing angry. That night, as they all gathered in the living room, the house seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The walls creaked, the floorboards groaned, and the air grew thick with an unnatural cold. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Tommy could hear it again, the breathing, the scratching, and then the unmistakable sound of something dragging itself across the floor. He clung to his mother, tears streaming down his face, as Father Donovan began to chant louder, his voice echoing through the room. And then, all at once, everything went silent. The house was still, as if holding its breath, waiting. Tommy's father reached for a candle and lit it, casting a dim glow across the room. In the flickering light, they saw it, the figure standing in the doorway, its eyes glowing a fierce yellow, its mouth twisted into a sinister grin. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin like shadows stretched across the walls. "Don't look," Father Donovan warned, but it was too late. The monster lunged forward, its clawed hands reaching out toward Tommy. Father Donovan stepped forward, his voice rising in a powerful chant, attempting to push back the creature with words of faith and strength. But the monster seemed unfazed. It continued to advance, its eyes locked onto Tommy. The room grew colder with each step it took, frost forming on the windows and breath visible in the dim candlelight. Tommy's heart raced, and he could feel a cold sweat break out on his skin as the monster closed in, its grin widening as if relishing his fear. Tommy's father grabbed a chair and threw it at the creature in a desperate attempt to protect his son, but the chair passed right through it as if it were made of smoke. The monster didn't even flinch. It reached the edge of the room and paused, as if savoring the moment. Father Donovan continued his prayers, his voice shaking but unwavering, "I command you, in the name of all that is holy, to leave this place." The monster turned its head slowly toward Father Donovan, and for a moment, its grin faltered, its eyes narrowing. Then, with a swift motion, it lunged toward him, knocking him to the ground. Tommy's mother screamed, grabbing Tommy and pulling him close. His father rushed forward, trying to pull the creature away from the priest, but his hands passed through its smoky form again. The monster seemed to grow larger, its eyes burning brighter with every second, as if drawing strength from the chaos and fear around it. Desperate, Tommy's mother shouted, "Tommy, don't be afraid. Remember what Father Donovan said, it feeds on fear." She held Tommy tight, trying to calm him down. Tommy tried to steady his breathing, to block out the terrifying sight in front of him. He focused on his mother's voice, repeating over and over in his mind, "It's not real, it's not real." The creature's eyes flicked toward Tommy, sensing the shift in his fear. It growled, a low, menacing sound that vibrated through the walls. Father Donovan, now struggling to his feet, raised a trembling hand and began to chant again. This time, his words were different, softer, almost melodic. The creature hesitated, its form flickering like a candle flame in a breeze. Tommy's father and mother joined in the chanting, though they didn't know the words. Their voices added strength to Father Donovan's, and the room began to feel warmer, the frost on the windows melting away. Tommy looked at the monster, its eyes no longer glowing as brightly. For a moment, he saw a flicker of something else in its gaze, fear. The monster roared in frustration, swinging its shadowy limbs wildly, but the chanting seemed to weaken it, its form growing more transparent. Father Donovan stepped forward, holding a small crucifix in front of him, his voice growing stronger. "You have no power here," he shouted, and the monster let out a shriek that rattled the windows. The creature began to retreat, its body shrinking back toward the doorway, its eyes still fixed on Tommy. "Don't look away, Tommy," Father Donovan urged. "You have to face it, to show it you're not afraid." Trembling, Tommy nodded, stepping out from his mother's protective embrace. He stared directly into the monster's eyes, his own filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I'm not afraid of you," he whispered, more to himself than to the creature. With each word, the monster seemed to lose more of its form, becoming more like smoke than solid. It shrieked again, a sound of pure rage and frustration, but its power was fading. The house groaned one last time, and then, with a final scream, the monster vanished, dissolving into the shadows. The room fell silent, the oppressive cold lifting as warmth returned to the house. Everyone stood still, hardly daring to believe it was over. Tommy's mother hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. Father Donovan lowered his crucifix, breathing heavily but smiling. "It's gone," he said softly. "For now. But these things have a way of coming back if they sense weakness." He looked at Tommy, his expression serious. "You did well, son. But you must always remember, fear gives them power. Never forget that." In the days that followed, the house seemed to return to normal. The oppressive feeling was gone, and Tommy began to sleep through the night without fear. His parents, however, remained vigilant, always checking under the bed and in closets, just in case. Father Donovan continued to visit, reinforcing the protections he had put in place, assuring them that the house was safe. But Tommy knew, deep down, that things would never be the same. He had seen the darkness that lurked beneath his bed, the creature that fed on fear. And he knew it wasn't gone for good. It was out there, somewhere, waiting for another chance. As he lay in bed each night, he kept his eyes open, listening to the silence, ready to face whatever might come. Because now he understood that sometimes, the monsters in the dark were all too real. And one evening, just as Tommy was drifting off to sleep, he heard it again, a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from under the bed. Tommy, his heart raced, but this time, he didn't scream. He didn't cry out for his parents. Instead, he took a deep breath, clenched his fists, and whispered back, "I'm not afraid of you." And for the first time in what felt like forever, he closed his eyes and fell into a peaceful sleep, the whisper fading into nothingness. A few weeks passed, and the Wilsons slowly settled back into their routine. Tommy was no longer waking up in the middle of the night, screaming or crying. The house felt lighter, the oppressive shadows receding into the corners. The family dared to believe that the nightmare was over, that the monster had truly been banished. But then, small things started to happen, things that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Tommy's toys, once neatly arranged, would be found scattered across the room. His drawings of monsters under the bed returned, even though he swore he hadn't drawn them. And the whispers never fully stopped. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were there, lurking just beneath the threshold of hearing, like a bad memory that refused to fade. His parents dismissed it as residual fear, an overactive imagination. But Tommy knew better. One rainy afternoon, Tommy's father decided to take a deeper look into the history of the house. Something about the journal Mrs. Wilson had found kept nagging at him, as if there was more to the story that they were missing. He returned to the Historical Society, poring over old records and news clippings. The more he dug, the more he realized how many families had been affected by the same phenomenon, the same stories, the same fears, the same disappearances. As he flipped through the old newspaper archives, he came across an article that sent a chill down his spine. It was dated over a century ago and detailed the account of a young boy named Edward, the same boy Mrs. Harding had mentioned. But there was a detail that everyone seemed to have missed: Edward was not the first. The house had a much darker past. Decades before Edward's disappearance, the home belonged to a reclusive man rumored to dabble in dark arts. Children in the neighborhood had gone missing, their bodies never found. The town had hushed up the incidents, chalking them up to the dangers of the forests surrounding the property. But there was more. The article hinted at a curse placed upon the house, a curse that would draw the darkness to it, feeding on the fears of the innocent. The man had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and the house had remained vacant for years, gaining a reputation for being haunted. When it was finally sold, the disappearances began anew. Tommy's father felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just a random haunting, this was something much more malevolent, something that had deep roots in the very foundation of the house. Returning home, he shared his findings with his wife and Father Donovan, who had continued to check in on the family. The priest's face grew grim. "This isn't just about Tommy," he said quietly. "This house, it's a beacon for something dark. The creature you saw is just one of many manifestations of that darkness. It draws strength from the fear it creates, and as long as there are those who fear it, it will never truly be gone." Tommy, overhearing this conversation, felt a chill run down his spine. For the first time, he realized that the monster under his bed was just the beginning, a symptom of a deeper evil that had plagued his home for generations. The revelation was terrifying, but it also brought a strange sense of clarity. If the darkness was tied to the house, then they needed to sever that connection, to break the cycle that had held so many families captive. That night, as the family gathered in the living room, Father Donovan proposed a plan. "We need to confront this entity head-on," he said. "Not just banish it temporarily, but force it to reveal its true form and sever its hold on this place once and for all." He began to set up an array of candles and symbols around the room, preparing for a ritual that would challenge the very essence of the house's malevolence. Tommy stood by his mother's side, his heart pounding. The room grew colder as Father Donovan began to chant, his voice steady and strong. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist, as if alive. The candles flickered, casting eerie shapes across the room. Suddenly, a low growl emanated from the darkness, and the room was filled with the sound of scratching, like claws against wood. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as the chanting intensified. The shadows seemed to converge, forming a dark mass in the center of the room. Tommy's father held his breath, clutching a wooden cross tightly in his hand. His mother whispered prayers under her breath, her eyes wide with fear. And then, from the center of the darkness, the creature emerged, not as a shadow, but as a solid, terrifying figure, its eyes glowing with a fierce, otherworldly light. It stood tall, towering over them, its limbs long and twisted, its mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. It spoke, its voice a deep, guttural rasp that echoed through the room. "You think you can banish me? I am as old as fear itself. I have fed on your kind for centuries. You cannot defeat what you cannot understand." Father Donovan stepped forward, raising his crucifix high. "We may not understand you," he said, his voice unwavering, "but we know what you are. A parasite, feeding on the innocent, using fear as your weapon. But tonight, we end this." He threw a handful of salt into the air, and it burst into flames, forming a circle around the creature. The monster roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of the house. It lunged at them, but was stopped by the circle of fire. It thrashed and writhed, its form flickering like a dying flame. Tommy watched in awe and terror as the creature began to shrink, its body collapsing in on itself. "You will never be free of me," it hissed, its voice fading. "I will always be here, waiting in the dark, feeding on your fear." And then, with a final, piercing scream, the creature dissolved into smoke, the fire extinguishing with a soft hiss. The room fell silent, the oppressive cold lifting as warmth returned. Tommy looked around, his heart still racing, but for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. The house was quiet, truly quiet, and the whispers were gone. Father Donovan turned to the family, exhausted but smiling. "It's over," he said softly. "The house is cleansed." But as they began to breathe a sigh of relief, a soft, almost inaudible whisper echoed through the room, Tommy's name, carried on the wind. His eyes widened, but he said nothing. He knew, deep down, that the darkness might never truly be gone. But for now, at least, it was silent. As the family left the room, a cold breeze blew through the house, extinguishing the last of the candles. And in the darkness, beneath the bed, a pair of yellow eyes flickered briefly before disappearing once more into the shadows.